It's said that Kevin Bacon is separated from all other actors by only 6 degrees. While that's not strictly speaking true, it might be interesting to explore the interconnectedness of the film industry. At any rate, it's probably a good jumping-off point for a movie review YouTube channel. With that in mind, welcome to the 6 Degrees Movie Review Marathon. Before we start, a note about the rules. Each film must share one actor or actress with a previous film in the series. Film franchises are excluded from the potential choices, because each of those might have its own video series in the future. For my purposes, a franchise will be defined as a trilogy or longer set of connected movies. Sequels will be allowed in this series, though they can't be viewed consecutively. The goal of this marathon is to create as long a chain of films as possible, without using the same connection twice. Shall we begin? I chose 65 for its small footprint, but I'm not all that familiar with Adam Driver's filmography beyond Star Wars, which is disallowed from this marathon, and Ariana Greenblatt is still up and coming. This didn't leave me with a frontrunner for the next film in the series. I could connect using either of them, but trying once again to be strategic, I chose a 2021 historical drama starring Adam Driver titled The Last Duel. It's a high-stakes he said, she said, in that order, during 14th century France's Me Too moment. The Last Duel tells the story of the final judicial trial-by-combat duel in France. Sir Jean de Carouge, a severe and boorish knight with a habit of angering his liege lords, challenges his one-time friend Jacques Legris, a much more laid-back squire, for allegedly raping his wife, Marguerite. The story is presented in 3 perspectives, in order to cloud the truth of the situation using the characters' biases. Jean's story makes the case that he is an honorable squire, eventually knighted, who has been consistently targeted by Jacques, an upstart who uses his friendship with the Count to advance his own status by stealing what is rightfully Jean's. Taking liberties with his wife is just the final insult. Jacques' story frames him as a fun-loving, loyal friend to a man who becomes increasingly paranoid and self-destructive. He believes himself to be irresistible to women, but only found love when he met Marguerite, Jean's wife. He believes there was no rape because she was willing, despite her protestations. Marguerite paints a story of 2 overbearing men whose selfish desires delude them into destructive decisions. She is a woman in a society that doesn't value them, but when her husband is away at war, she discovers her own aptitude. This newfound sense of independence prompts her to speak up when Jacques violates her, not truly understanding the exact repercussions that she will face when she does. After all, if her husband loses his duel to the death, the law promises her a much harsher fate. The elephant in the room for this film is its comparison to Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon. The multiple unreliable perspectives aspect of The Last Duel is actually pretty weak. Each story inherently gives more context by showing more of what happened in certain scenes, but the idea that all parties are lying is underused. There is a handful of distinct changes between tellings, but these are mostly embellishments of what would at least be semi-public record, since most of the scenes were witnessed by other people. There isn't a pervasive sense that each story is meant to make the protagonist look best to the detriment of the others. They basically focus on single character traits, rather than manipulating interpretations of events to their benefit. For example, Jean's story creates portrayals of righteousness and loyalty, or the lack thereof. But Jacques' own story does a better job demonstrating his lack of righteousness than Jean's does, when that is supposed to be Jean's entire focus. Then, Jacques' story demonstrates his intelligence, but also explicitly admits that his perspective is delusional. He has a dream in which Marguerite seduces him, which later becomes one of the charges waged against Marguerite during the trials. Marguerite's story strips away the self-aggrandizing aspects of the male perspectives, but her perspective is the worst from a Rashomon standpoint. The writers decided that hers was the actual truth, but that choice breaks the concept entirely. If she's completely trustworthy, why even show the other sides? Her story becomes the story. The plot is largely bound by the actual historical events that the narrative depicts, but it depicts them well. I noticed only one issue with the timeline. Jacques supposedly collects Jean's debts last, which prompts him to go to war for the remaining money he needs, during which time he negotiates Marguerite's dowry, adding a property to it that must have already been taken by Jacques at that point, if Jean indeed was approached last about his debts. The rest of the writing seemed rather tight. The subtle changes between perspectives could be a little too subtle at times, which isn't itself a writing problem, except that the point of using multiple perspectives is to create the uncertainty about who is truly instigating the duel, Jean, Jacques, or Marguerite. Instead, the story uses doubts about Marguerite's account of events to draw comparisons to modern conceptions about how women are sometimes treated today when coming forward about sexual assault. But the point of using multiple perspectives should have really been to develop uncertainty over whether or not it was Marguerite's idea to come forward at all, or if she was pressured to make the accusation by Jean. This is largely how the male perspectives are framed. However, the necessary uncertainty is completely undermined for two reasons. First, because we know that the act occurred. Both Marguerite's and Jacques' perspectives admit it happened, so there's no doubt. The film doesn't even obscure the motive, since there is never any insinuation of a willing affair. The second reason we don't have uncertainty about who instigates the trial is because we have Marguerite's perspective in which she instigates it. There's no ambiguity. It's a fatal flaw that can't really be overstated. In trying to push popular current-day political messages during the third act, and only the third act, the film dismantled its own plot, style, and themes. It was astounding to watch. My problem with rating the story is that it's written rather well otherwise. It's above average, but self-sabotaging. 6 out of 10? Talking about the characters may become a bit complicated for this film. As I stated, most of the Rashomon effect is displayed through their self-perceptions, rather than through the plot points themselves. Jean de Carouge sees himself as a noble, honest man who is a loving husband. He believes that he would be well-respected and wealthy if only he weren't being sabotaged at every turn. However, we see from his wife that he is neither a loving husband nor a competent lord. He is constantly seeking get-rich-quick schemes, while neglecting the duties and steady revenue streams of his station in the feudal system. His marriage also seems to stem from this tendency, which is why he is so angered when the dowry is reduced by its most valuable asset. When his schemes fail and his money is exhausted, he enlists in whatever war effort is available to him, because that affords him a lump sum payment from the crown upon his return. Jacques considers him impulsive, which seems true, but also a bad soldier, which is probably not. Combat seems to be the only thing for which Jean has an aptitude. He suffers major defeats, perhaps because of a failure of his own leadership, but he always returns alive. Matt Damon gives the most varied performance of the film, as his character changes the most between perspectives. Jacques believes himself to be the most intelligent, attractive, and dutiful man in the whole country. His perspective diminishes the character of the Count into a drunken, lecherous fool, fancying himself as the true leader and administrator of the fiefdom. This is but the first of his delusions in the film. Let's put it this way. Jacques is harder on Count Pierre than Jean is, and Jean hates him. In reality, Jacques is a bit of a tyrant. He became overzealous in collecting the delinquent rents for Pierre, trying to prove himself and advance his status, which caused him to take more than what was owed, part of which he likely weaseled for himself. He may not always instigate the Count's retaliations against Jean, but he certainly doesn't mind benefiting from them. Jean pushes the narrative that Jacques is poisoning the Count against him, but it seems more likely that the Count doesn't care much for either of them. But Jacques is a sycophant, whereas Jean is actively annoying. Marguerite doesn't think much of him at all, but she encourages the reconciliation between Jean and Jacques as a means of returning to a more pleasant lifestyle, which is completely misunderstood by Jacques. As for Marguerite, she begins her perspective as a pawn, sold by her father for legitimacy to a man who is more interested in her dowry than her. She then spends much of the story navigating Jean's erratic emotions, while suffering his company in bed. As he administers his estate, she notices the disdain his serfs have for him, and when he goes off to war, she tries to right the course, sometimes deferring to the judgment of the men, and sometimes making decisions for herself. She also finds a minor nemesis in Jean's stoic mother, who disapproves of her for reasons that aren't much deeper than Marguerite hasn't yet borne a child for her son. Marguerite has a distinct lack of flaws in this story. She is the judge of the male characters, revealing their inadequacies, and removing the veil of nobility in their words and deeds. But she doesn't receive the same treatment from their perspectives, so all we get is a true noblewoman who is persevering over all kinds of external victimization. Even her friends turn on her when she makes her rape public. She's not the cause of any misunderstandings, including her own ignorance of the penalties she faces if the trial swings to Jacques' benefit. She was just not given prudent counsel regarding the laws. She is a walking paragon with only one flaw, that she didn't use her magnificence to free the other women in the story from their patriarchal tyranny. I kid, but it's not actually that far off from the subtextual political messaging that appears exclusively in her perspective. I should make one final point about the acting. None of the actors even attempted French accents in this film. The closest might have been Jean's mother, but only because she says Marguerite's name differently. Although this is an extremely odd choice, it might actually add points to the acting. I don't know if I could have watched the whole thing if they had tried. For characters, 7 out of 10. In terms of cinematography, this movie is very well filmed. The world feels large and solid. The shots are exquisitely framed, with special focus given to the background and side characters. Even if their faces aren't clearly seen, they each have a purpose to their presence and a goal to complete while on the screen. Everything is blocked and choreographed with care. The world, the characters, and the events exist independent of the prospective characters' acknowledgement of them. The costumes are robust and well thought out, and are even incorporated into the story at one point. I won't try to comment on their historical accuracy, because this region and time period are not within my specialties. But there is a varied set of designs befitting characters of differing statures, as well as some added detailing to reflect the importance the POV characters place on appearance more generally. Non-diegetic music is used sparingly and to great dramatic effect. Most scenes have no musical backing, but as the POV character reaches important peaks or valleys in his or her story, the music rises to greet it. For Jean, this happens mostly when his war accomplishments are acknowledged. For Jacques, it's when he makes impassioned speeches, or otherwise recognizes his superiority, especially over Jean. Incidentally, the rape scene from Jacques' perspective is silent, but the holy confession defending his actions afterwards has a song behind it. Marguerite's music plays when she believes she's challenging wrong with right. It's a clever way to distinguish how the characters view the events without verbal commentary. I would place cinematography at a 9 out of 10. It is often easy to enjoy a quality product, which this by and large is. So, in this section, I will discuss the elements that may shave points away from such a score. The shift to political messaging in the third act was a serious turnoff. It wasn't just the Me Too or rape culture underpinning either. The Count advises Jacques to deny, deny, deny. It's not inconceivable that someone would use that phrase, but its modern context created an abrasion that harmed my engagement with the scene. This occurred a few other times specifically during Marguerite's storyline. Most notably, the phrase, "it's just science," irked me during the trial. It's trite and oddly petty for a movie that takes itself seriously most of the time. I also found it odd that they added the Oberyn Martell confess scene to the combat at the end. Jacques doesn't admit anything, and that has no consequence to the rest of the film. Given Jean's personality, Jacques' ardent denial, even on the brink of death, would probably have caused a rift between he and his wife. He would never truly know whose child she bore, and never trust that she wasn't a willing participant. She would also be kept on a much tighter leash from then on, and she wasn't normally permitted to be unattended even in her own home. Her life with Jean should have become demonstrably worse than it already had been, but it doesn't, inexplicably. Then the movie ends with a textual description of their lives after the duel. I know it's not the point of the story, the duel is, but it was strange that the duel didn't produce any repercussions. For enjoyment, I suppose I can give this an 8 out of 10. Combining the scores, this is a 7.5 out of 10 film. I'd be happy recommending it, especially to people who enjoy medieval settings. It was a nice view into the time period. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments section. Am I being too harsh? Or too nice? If you liked this video, I would appreciate it if you clicked the little buttons below and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks again, and I hope to see you when the marathon continues.